Hey folks, David Stewart here. No video today. It's going to be an audio-only video, as oxymoronic as that sounds. And that is because I don't have the lighting set up in my new house yet, and I don't want to look like crap on camera. So you'll have to make do with my illustrious voice and not my fabulous visage. But today I want to talk about the new Grinch movie, not the old one with Jim Carrey. I'll probably do a second video on that one because I think it's a great example of a terrible movie. This one is not as terrible as that movie. This is the new one by Illumination, the same company that did the Despicable Me movies and the Minion movies and all that kind of stuff. And I would like to give some detailed scores on this, but I can't, and that's because I fell asleep during the movie. And I fell asleep during the movie for a couple of minutes at least, mostly because it was incredibly boring. And it was boring on multiple levels, but the level in which it was most boring was the story. The Grinch is a great example of a movie where Hollywood plays everything safe. They play everything by the numbers, they do everything by the book, and the end result is something that's so predictable, so banal in fact, that it's really not worth watching. Now I say that it was better than the older Grinch movie, mostly because that older Grinch movie is torture to watch, whereas this one merely puts you to sleep. The problem with both these movies, though, is the attempt to adapt a children's picture book into a major motion picture that lasts 90 minutes. There's just not enough story in one of those little children's books to make a 90-minute movie without throwing the entire thing out and making something entirely different based on maybe the central idea of the book. Kind of like what they did with Boss Baby. Boss Baby would be an example of you take a children's picture book, you get the central idea, you throw everything about it away and just write a movie with the same name. In this case, they really try to have the story of How the Grinch Stole Christmas by Dr. Seuss, but there's not enough there for a 90-minute movie. Maybe there's enough there for like the old TV special, the cartoon one, which is why people like that one, but for a 90-minute movie, there's just not enough there. So you add in a bunch of extra subplots that don't really aid in the central idea of the story and, in fact, detract from it. The primary B story of this new Grinch movie centers around this little girl in Whoville. And she has some sort of Christmas wish to help her mother. And her mother is, of course, the enshrined single mother that we get so commonly. It's almost omnipresent these days in Hollywood movies. You have a single mother who's having to work nights to provide for her many children, who is somehow able to be a supermom amongst that and take care of her kids, provide them with emotional support, make them peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And indeed, the kids are really well adjusted to that particular situation. They're not delinquent. They are not having trouble at school, but they are aware, and this little girl is aware that her mother is very tired from all the effort that she's putting in to actually taking care of her kids and working. Also missing from this enshrined single mother that you see repeated again and again in modern movies is any kind of explanation as to how the mother got there. We don't know if this mother is a widow. We don't know if she's divorced. We don't know if she never married the father or fathers of her children. Now, it's possible I missed that. I did fall asleep during part of this movie, but to me, it was never really explained. But what is shown is that the single mother is a particularly excellent and virtuous person. Now, if that story seems completely superfluous to How the Grinch Stole Christmas, it is. Not only is it completely superfluous, it doesn't even really get a resolution at the end. The Grinch gets a sort of resolution in having this Christmas dinner with the single mom and her family, but we don't really have a resolution as to how the single mother will be helped as part of the Christmas wish, unless we think that like the Grinch, this weird green creature, is going to somehow end up in a relationship with the single mom. The resolution of the B story is a big miss, let's just put it that way. Also added into this movie is some backstory as to why the Grinch doesn't like Christmas and why he's such a jerkface. They make him, I think, an orphan that was upset that nobody liked him for Christmas to give him gifts, and so now he hates Christmas. This is something that you see in a lot of Hollywood movies as an attempt to explain just a very simple static villain's backstory, explain why evil is a certain way, and it usually has to do with some traumatic backstory. And this is something that they did in the Jim Carrey movie as well. And at the same time, they also mention what is in the book, that like his heart was just 3 sizes too small. So instead of having a story about a villain who gets redeemed and learns what good is. Instead, you have a story about somebody who isn't really a villain, who's really the victim of circumstances coming back around to where he's supposed to be. And those two things have a very different feeling when it comes to conflict and resolution. And indeed, the entire movie spends time trying to make the Grinch into a highly sympathetic person. And they do this through a bunch of different techniques. They do it through little bits of story dialogue. They do it through the way that they portray him physically. He's not a really wicked-looking guy. He's not a guy that you immediately think of as a bad guy. And that actually might be important, because if you're going to make a 90-minute movie that centers around the Grinch rather than like a 20-minute little cartoon, then you're going to have to make that character somewhat sympathetic, or people, especially children and families, are going to get annoyed at the character, or you have to make some other character be the primary protagonist. They kind of did both. They had this little girl who wanted this Christmas wish to help her mother, and then you had the Grinch as this sympathetic non-villain. Now, that's most of the reasons why this movie sucks. And mostly it sucks because it's boring, and we can predict where all of the story arcs are going to go as soon as they're introduced. It makes for a very uninteresting watch. There are some positive things that I can say about this movie. The big one is really the visuals. The visuals are fairly boring. However, they're far better than what we've seen as far as Dr. Seuss adaptations in the 3D space. This is a 3D animated film, not a 2D cell animation, not a live action film like the older Grinch movie. And if you were to compare this to the Grinch movie that Ron Howard directed with Jim Carrey, this one is a lot more pleasing to the eye, because what they did is they started with Dr. Seuss's visual style, and then they mostly threw it out the window. They have some very subtle allusions to it, but that highly distorted Dr. Seuss style, they really just threw it out the window and made something that is more in line with the Illumination standard animation that you've seen before. The characters have more standard proportions. Their faces look a lot better than what they would look like in the live action version. Buildings and vehicles look functional and habitable. And in general, that's necessary if you're going to have it in a 3D space. The 2D style of Dr. Seuss works great in 2D as a representation of objects, but as soon as you start trying to make those objects real, like in a live action or in a 3D animation film, it's not going to work out very well. So I actually appreciate that they threw out most of the aesthetics and just tried to keep the flavor of what Dr. Seuss drew in his original books, rather than try to keep the actual stylistic proportions of what he used to draw. As to the other production elements, they're mostly par. The score itself for the movie was pretty boring. It wasn't particularly bad. It wasn't particularly good, with the exception of the insertion of some hip-hop style versions of the older Grinch songs from the TV special that are frankly horrible. And I think that's actually what woke me up midway through the movie, was some of those songs, not in a good way. They're very unpleasing to the ear. So if I were going to give a score to the music, including those elements, it would end up being like a 3 or 4 out of 10. If they removed those annoying pop music elements, it'd be probably a 5 or a 6. So par, low average. Dialogue and acting, it's fine. It's not particularly good. It's not particularly bad. It sounds like they had a child playing the little girl, and whenever you have children acting, it's always just a little bit off compared to having an adult act a child's part, particularly when you have a 3D animated film. There's no real reason to have a child in a child's part when you can have an adult who's a better actor be able to portray that particular part. So that was a little bit off, but overall, the dialogue wasn't that bad. It was very phoned in. It was very cheesy, very predictable. The story is very predictable, so all of that goes together as you would expect. So that's the new Grinch movie in a nutshell. It's boring, it's predictable, it's a standard Hollywood cash-in on an established IP that's going to get people to come see it regardless of how good or bad it is, and they chose probably not to invest a lot of resources in the production of this particular movie, and it shows. At the same time, it's not nearly as annoying as the older Grinch movie, and it's not particularly offensive compared to most Hollywood movies. Like a lot of secular Christmas movies, they avoid any mention of Christ except for one song that is sung to the Grinch. I think it's actually the pentatonics singing, but they're singing like God rest you merry gentlemen, I think, and there is a mention of Christ, our Savior, and that's the only mention of Christ you ever get in this Christmas movie, which I think is par for the course for modern Hollywood. Likewise, Dr. Seuss is a great book for secular Hollywood to adapt because it just avoids any messaging about what Christmas really is about in a religious sense and just focuses entirely on some sort of good feelings that are separate from the material part of Christmas. But as a Christian, I'm tired of secular Christmas. I get exhausted from it every single year, and I get really annoyed by this endless wave of cash in, cash grab Christmas movies that happen on TV and at the movie theater every single year. And they all have the exact same messaging that this movie has, which is that Christmas is not all about commercial goods. It's not all about presents. It's not about stuff. But they're presenting that message through a commercial product, a product intended to make money, and a product intended to grab people's cash. It's deeply ironic and offensive when you stop and think about it. Even Home Alone was full of nativities and churches. We don't even get that in modern movies. Christ has been completely excised from the discussion of Christmas. And I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but The Grinch is a great example. It's a boring, heartless Christmas movie intended to take your money and make you feel good about something that has had its symbolism completely revoked. What's left of Christmas when you take Christ out of it? Well, it's just a bunch of old folk traditions that have themselves been divorced from their original meaning. I don't really dig that. And I didn't really dig this movie, so that's what it is, The Grinch. Another boring, heartless Hollywood Christmas movie. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see and hear in the comments section down below. I try to get to those comments, or email me, stu@dvspress.com, and I'll try to shoot you back an email. Things have been chaotic lately because I've been moving, but I try to get back to those kinds of communications as quick as I can. Thank you so much, and I will see you guys next time.